Friends, I would like to ask us for a pause, and I want us to pause for a moment of silence. And I want us to do this for the 101 hostages that were taken from Israel into Gaza by Hamas terrorists who are still there. They were part of a group of 251. They've been there now for 363 days. That started on October the 7th, on a Shabbat morning, which was also the Jewish holiday of Simchat Torah. Their pictures are here. We hold them here. Each of them, dead or alive, has a name, a family, a story. They should be with their families, their communities today, just as we are. So let's pause now for their sake and for the sake of their families. I am so grateful to a group of local Israelis who took the initiative to say that we should walk on their behalf. We've been doing this on Sunday afternoons. There will be one this Sunday, October the 6th, on Battleground Avenue in the afternoon. You can find more information on that in the worship handout. They walk for 18 minutes, 18 signifying life. They hold pictures of those, including the children who are still being held. Thank you to those who have walked on their behalf. Thank you to those who will walk on their behalf. May they all be home speedily and soon, safely and alive, as together we say, Amen.
Amen.
Friends, it was the highly regarded biblical scholar H.L. Ginsburg who was once hanging out with his buddy, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. You may have heard Heschel's name before. He marched with Dr. King. He was one of the great Jewish leaders and theologians of last century. They were hanging out one day at a stairwell in their academy, and Heschel turned to Ginsburg with this question. He said, "Who is the most tragic figure in the Bible?" And Ginsburg responded with the answer that you might expect. He started listing characters in the Bible. Jacob, he said, he fled from his brother who was whatever, after he had taken his birthright and his blessing. Jacob was cheated twice, time and again by his family. His beloved Rachel died young. His sons couldn't get along. And he lived for years thinking that his beloved son Joseph had died. Or maybe it was also Job. That was another tragic character, the poster child for when bad things happen to good people. Or maybe it was Jeremiah, H.L. Ginsburg said. The one who had the first-hand witness of the brutality visited on our people during the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians 2,600 years ago. Jeremiah, who wrote the book of Lamentations, which is impossible to read without crying. Heschel heard what Ginsburg had listed. He rejected each of his answers. Scholars sometimes do that. Heschel turned to his buddy and said, No. The most tragic figure in the Bible is not Jacob. It's not Job. It's not even Jeremiah. The most tragic figure in the Bible was God. Why? Because God was so alone. Heschel will go on to write a book called Man's Search for God. By the way, back in the day, when they said man, they meant humanity. And he'll also write a book called God's Search for Man. God is alone. One God. That's what the Jewish people bring to the world. Rosh Hashanah, our tradition, has us imagine that today is the birthday of the universe. And there's a teaching that tells that the reason that God started to create, the reason that those words, "let there be light," were uttered and went forth, is that God was lonely. That first section of the book of Genesis, as God is creating, points out that with each creation, God says tov, or even tov ma'od, those Hebrew words meaning good and very good. Yet when humanity is created, God will later remark, "Lo tov heyot adam levado." It's not good for human beings to be alone. The fact is, we don't need the Torah to tell us that loneliness is lo tov, that it's not good. Just think back to those moments in your own life when you felt on your own, when you felt isolated, new somewhere, sitting by yourself, alone. In the spring of 2023, not that long ago, it was roughly 3 years into the COVID pandemic, the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, he declared loneliness an epidemic in our country. In his advisory, it was noted that being lonely and isolated can increase the risk for premature death to levels comparable to smoking daily. Some of you in the room I know remember Dr. Ruth. Dr. Ruth Westheimer. You know, she passed away this summer at the age of 96. Not from loneliness, by the way. Dr. Ruth was a 4'7" German Jew, a Holocaust survivor. She later moved to British Mandatory Palestine. She joined the Hashanah, what ultimately would become the Israeli Defense Forces. She was wounded in her service. Dr. Ruth was a therapist who had a radio talk show and was super famous in the 1980s. If you've got little kids in the room and you feel like you got to put your hands over their ears for a second, here's your moment to do so. If you remember Dr. Ruth, you know that she spoke openly and with much humor about sex, and her famous catchphrase you might remember was, "Get some." You're rethinking that whole not covering their ear thing now, right? 96 when she passed away this July. And I mention this because the last book that she wrote came out last month. It was a few months a few months after she died. And that kind of caught my attention. I'm like, how do you do that? Right? It was her 46th book. It was entitled The Joy of Connections. It's not about what you think. Kind of. The book's about loneliness. Actually, it's about how to beat loneliness. She offers her readers 100 practical tips on how to do this. In her book, Dr. Ruth admits that she too experienced painful isolation and loneliness in her life. The Holocaust left her without parents. She grew up in an orphanage. In the summer of her 17th year, already in late-term adolescence, she wrote in her diary the following words: "I live with 150 people and am alone." Loneliness, she writes, thinking back on her teenage years, has nothing to do with the number of people around you. These days we would say it's not relative to the number of friends you have on whatever platform or followers. When it comes to meaning, to belonging, to feeling seen and heard, it's never, ever about quantity. The quality and content of our relationships, those are the things that matter more, that matter the most. Dr. Ruth does not reference October 7th and this past year in her book. But today, as we see the first light of this new year, it's so important to talk about loneliness. And it's also important to talk about what Israelis and so many of us have been living through this past year. I think back to a Zoom call that my rabbinic class put together on October 25th, 2 weeks or so after the initial Hamas terror attacks. We have a few classmates, Reform rabbis who live in Israel. One of them is Rabbi Susan Silverman. Susan has been a guest of ours in Greensboro. You may be familiar with her, well, we would say her famous sister, comedian Sarah Silverman. I am not going to do any of her jokes, so there you go. Susan's a dear friend. She's like my North Star when it comes to so many issues. Those who traveled with Michal and me to Israel have likely had Friday night dinner at her family's home in Jerusalem. So we're on our Zoom call. We were there to give her support. She updated us. She expressed her gratitude. Her perspective was that after the initial shock, she and her family were shaken but managing. And then the tone of her voice changed, Susan. She said that she felt for us, those of us who were here in the United States, those of us outside of Israel. You see, she said she could walk outside of her home and people could relate to what she was experiencing in the city of Jerusalem. People in Jerusalem got her. They understood her feelings. She told us that she felt anything but alone. However, what was happening in the United States, the responses that were being exhibited online, she in the middle of a war zone just days after the largest single-day onslaught against Jewish people since the end of the Holocaust, with hundreds having been taken captive as hostage, she was concerned about us and our communities, that we would be set upon, that we would be isolated, and that we would be alone. So I should say, I didn't feel that way on October 9th. I didn't feel alone on October 9th when Greensboro's Jewish community gathered for solidarity prayers less than 72 hours after the attack here in this room. I didn't feel that way as the largest gathering of Jews in the history of the United States took place in D.C. in November. Why would I? 290,000 were there in person and another 250,000 were on the live stream. I surely didn't feel that way as I went to Israel with a solidarity group organized by our federation this past winter. Seeing what we saw in the communities attacked on October 7th, speaking with hostage families who not only feel lonely themselves but worry every second about the isolation their loved one is living through without any humanitarian aid, no international Red Cross visits. No, as tough as those moments were, loneliness was far from what I was feeling. But there have been times that I and so many others have felt very alone. And I've heard the same from you. I've heard the stories from our youth. They tell about the people who no longer want to be their friends. They talk about insults that they've suffered, how they feel alone. I've spoken with local Jewish people who've had their businesses boycotted because of their positive Jewish identification and their connection with Israel, their connection with this congregation. And they too, in those moments, have felt isolated and alone. So let me say this, because this is heavy. I will never tolerate anyone from our community saying insulting things about Arabs of any background, including Palestinian Arabs who deserve self-determination. We never teach or abide by anyone disparaging Islam or Muslims. But we will always stand up against those who seek to badger, belittle, or denigrate Jews and or Israel. Israel, like any country, is far from perfect, but half-truths, misleading presentations, purposefully vague rhymes, and bullying aren't things that we should ever let happen. People have a right to their opinions, but neither they nor anyone has a right to spread hatred, to isolate us, or to tell us that we should be alone. Jews make up a fraction of a percentage of this world's population. And this past year, I realized just how lonely that can be and feel. Look, I've always felt that community is a blessing. This temple is a blessing. Community is one of the ways that we respond to loneliness. This past year, maybe more than ever, we realized just how important community is. Which brings me to today. Today's Torah reading has a phrase that appears a few times. And whenever something is repeated in the Torah, our tradition sees it as indicating emphasis. It's like a giant exclamation point. Abraham and Isaac are going up the mountain. It's a traumatic moment that Abraham and Isaac are going through. And the passage says, the two of them walk together. In Hebrew, Vayelchu shnehem yachdav. The two of them walk together. That phrase appears twice in that regard, and then the conclusion of the passage that we read says, and they all went off and walked together. It emphasizes with that repetition. In the face of life's challenges, we have to walk together. Walking together. Being together. That's what we need to do more. We need to deepen our ties to one another. We need to stress how important community is. You saw it on the Bima today. Community is critical for our youth, for our families, for our elders, for all of us. It's how we can counter loneliness. It's how we always have done that. Because being together, a community, is kind of like a Jewish thing. Ask people about Judaism, what do we lead off with? It's not the whole one God thing all the time, or the mitzvot thing. First thing we go for, we talk about community. It's deeply embedded in Torah. That notion that we need to gather with one another. Rosh Hashanah wasn't unique. It was one of 7 times that the Torah calls for us to be together, to walk together. In ancient times, we would be together to hear the sounds of the shofar. These days, it might be the other way around. We sound the shofar as a reminder that being together, walking together, being in community is a blessing. I think we have an idea that communities are supposed to be places where everybody agrees. Where everybody agrees on everything. That's not community. That's not even a political party. I don't know real communities where something like that even exists. I once heard a clergy colleague say that community is the place where the people you most want to see, as well as the people you least want to see, both hang out. And I'll say this. If we as Jews have to teach that lesson to the rest of our country and the rest of the world, so be it. This temple community is so precious. It's a blessing. It's our answer to loneliness. We have to walk together. There will be much that we will agree on. That is true. But there will also be moments where we will going to need to agree to disagree. That's what more than communities do. That's what sacred communities do. Because the day will come when the fighting between Israel and its neighbors will cease. And I pray that that day comes soon. But while the fighting continues, we have each other. We have each other to walk with. We have each other to talk with. We have shoulders to cry on, ears that are open to listening, and hearts that are big enough for an incredible big tent embrace. The Jewish community, this Jewish community, is one of the most precious places that I've ever experienced in my life. Bottom line, it's a blessing. Let's continue to walk together as a temple, an amazing small-town historic Reformed congregation building even deeper and more meaningful ties. Ties with one another, ties with Jewish people everywhere, and ties with Israel. And as we walk together, let's continue to connect with other synagogues and Jewish groups in our area, walking even more with them, even more. And let's also continue walking with religious and civil groups of all backgrounds. Equally important, I pray that we in our youth will soon be able to walk together in a world that's free of anti-Semitism in all its forms, including the type that targets and smears Israel. And I pray that soon we will all be able to walk together in a world where we are recognized for our work in countering bias, bigotry, and hatred. I pray that soon we will be able to walk together in a world where loneliness gives way to an even greater sense of connection and community. Friends, we have our work cut out for us. That may be the challenge of the year going forth. I don't want us to walk alone. I want us to walk together, to talk together, and to work together as the strong Temple Emmanuel that we are. The Temple Emmanuel that we've always been, and the Temple Emmanuel we are destined to become. May God bless us as we take those steps. May God bless us and our neighbors, Israel and her neighbors, that soon we may all walk together in peace. With God we are never alone. With each other we are never alone. May this be a year of connection, growth, and blessed community, as together we all say, Amen. L'Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.